The champagne bubbles tickled my nose as I watched my son Matthew adjust his bow tie for the third time in 10 minutes. The Fairmont Grand Del Mar's crystal chandeliers cast everything in golden light, making even the most ordinary moments feel like they belonged in a magazine. I should have been the happiest mother alive. My only child was getting married to a beautiful woman in one of San Diego's most elegant venues. The Pacific Ocean breeze drifted through the open terrace doors, carrying with it the scent of jasmine and eucalyptus from the gardens below. But something felt wrong. It had been feeling wrong for months. "Mom, you look lovely," Matthew said, finally turning his attention to me. His smile was the same one he'd given me since he was 7 years old, but there was something different behind his eyes now, something distant. "That blue dress really suits you." I smoothed down the navy fabric of my dress, the one I'd bought specifically for this day, spending more than I usually would because I wanted to look perfect for my son's wedding. "Thank you, sweetheart. You look so handsome. Your father would be so proud." The mention of David always made Matthew's jaw tighten slightly. My husband had passed away 8 years ago, when Matthew was 24 and just starting his career in real estate development. David had been Matthew's hero, his guide, his moral compass. After the funeral, I'd watched my son slowly transform from the warm, caring boy I'd raised into someone harder, more calculating. Success came quickly for him, along with money, influence, and eventually Victoria. Victoria Lane, soon to be Victoria Briggs, 26 years old, blonde, with the kind of effortless beauty that made other women feel invisible. She worked as a marketing consultant for luxury brands, though I'd never been entirely clear on what that actually meant. What I did know was that she had expensive taste, strong opinions about everything, and a way of making me feel like I was always saying the wrong thing. "Where is Victoria?" I asked, glancing around the bridal suite where we'd been getting ready. The room was filled with white roses and baby's breath, and Victoria's wedding dress hung on a custom padded hanger that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget. "She's in the other suite with her bridesmaids," Matthew said, checking his Rolex. "They're doing some final touches on her makeup. You know how these things go." I didn't, actually. When David and I got married 35 years ago, we had a simple ceremony at St. Mark's Episcopal Church with a reception in the church hall. My mother helped me with my makeup using drugstore cosmetics, and my maid de session. Bridal suite was the church bathroom. But I kept that thought to myself. "The photographer wants to get some pictures of just you and me before the ceremony," Matthew continued. "Family shots. You know." Victoria insisted on it. Something about the way he said, "Victoria insisted," made my chest tighten. It wasn't that I didn't appreciate being included. It was the implication that without Victoria's insistence, it might not have happened at all. We walked together through the resort's marble corridors, past oil paintings of old California missions and windows that looked out onto perfectly manicured golf courses. Other wedding guests were starting to arrive, women in designer dresses and men in tailored suits. I recognized some of Matthew's college friends, his business partners, Victoria's sorority sisters from USC. What I didn't see were many familiar faces, people who had known Matthew as a child, neighbors from our old neighborhood in Chula Vista, family friends who had watched him grow up. The photographer, a trendy young man with an elaborate beard and expensive-looking equipment, positioned us near a fountain in the resort's courtyard. The water sparkled in the afternoon sun, and bougainvillea climbed the walls behind us in brilliant purple cascades. "Perfect lighting," the photographer murmured, adjusting his camera settings. "Okay, Eleanor, can you stand just a little to Matthew's left? Great. Now, Matthew, put your arm around your mother's shoulders." As Matthew's arm encircled me, I felt a wave of nostalgia so strong it nearly brought tears to my eyes. This was my little boy, the one who used to crawl into my bed during thunderstorms, who brought me dandelions from the backyard and called them sunshine flowers, who cried when he accidentally stepped on a snail. Where had that boy gone? "Smile, Mom," he whispered, and I did my best to comply. The photographer snapped away, asking us to move slightly, look at each other, look at the camera, laugh naturally. It was during one of these natural laughs that I caught a glimpse of Victoria watching us from a window above. Even from that distance, I could see her expression. Not angry, exactly, but calculating, like she was making mental notes. "That's a wrap for now," the photographer announced after about 15 minutes. "I'll get some more shots during the reception. The ceremony starts in 30 minutes, so you might want to head over to the chapel." The chapel was a small, elegant space with floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out onto the resort's rose garden. As guests began to file in, I took my seat in the front row on the groom's side. The space felt cavernous around me. On Victoria's side, 3 rows were packed with her family, parents, siblings, aunts, uncles, cousins, college friends. Her father, Robert Lane, was a successful plastic surgeon in Beverly Hills, and her mother, Patricia, looked like she could have been one of his patients. They were polite to me, but I always felt like they were speaking to me from across a great divide of wealth and social position. On Matthew's side, it was mostly me and a few scattered friends and colleagues. My sister Janet had flown in from Phoenix, and she sat beside me, squeezing my hand reassuringly. But the empty seats were stark reminders of how small our family had become, how isolated we'd grown. The music began, not the traditional wedding march, but something classical and sophisticated that I didn't recognize. Victoria appeared at the back of the chapel, and even I had to admit she looked breathtaking. Her dress was a creation of silk and lace that probably cost more than I spent on clothes in 2 years, and her grandmother's pearl tiara caught the light like captured starlight. But it was Matthew's face that made my breath catch. The way he looked at her, with such complete adoration, such overwhelming love, reminded me of how David used to look at me. It was beautiful and heartbreaking at the same time, because I realized that I hadn't seen that expression directed at me in years. The ceremony was elegant and perfectly orchestrated. Victoria and Matthew exchanged vows they had written themselves, speaking about partnership and ambition, and building a life together that would exceed their wildest dreams. The officiant, a family friend of the Lanes who apparently had some kind of special license to perform weddings, spoke about love as an investment that required careful tending and strategic planning. When they kissed as husband and wife, the chapel erupted in applause and cheers. Rice wasn't allowed at the resort, so guests threw rose petals instead, another touch that was beautiful and expensive, and somehow made me feel like I didn't belong. The receiving line felt endless. Guest after guest hugged Victoria and Matthew, offering congratulations and best wishes. When it was my turn, Victoria kissed my cheek with the same polite warmth she might show to a distant aunt. "Thank you for raising such a wonderful man," she said, her voice pitched perfectly for the guests around us to hear. "I promise I'll take good care of him." The implication that Matthew needed taking care of, that this was now her responsibility rather than something we might share, settled in my stomach like a stone, but I smiled and thanked her and told her how beautiful she looked, because that's what mothers-in-law are supposed to do. The cocktail hour was held on the resort's main terrace, with views of the valley stretching out toward the mountains. Waiters circulated with champagne and hors d'oeuvres that were too small and too fancy for my taste. I found myself standing alone by the terrace railing, watching the sun begin its descent toward the horizon, when Janet appeared beside me with 2 glasses of wine. "You holding up okay, Ellie?" she asked, using the nickname only she was allowed to use. "Of course," I said automatically. "It's a beautiful wedding. Victoria looks stunning. Matthew seems happy." Janet studied my face with the concerned expression she'd perfected during our 61 years as sisters. That's not what I asked. Before I could answer, Matthew appeared with Victoria on his arm. She had changed into a shorter reception dress, still white, but with a hemline that showed off her long legs and heels that cost more than my monthly car payment. "Mom, Aunt Janet, are you enjoying yourselves?" Matthew asked. "The photographer wants to get some family shots before dinner." More photos. This time we were arranged in various combinations. The 4 of us, just Matthew and me, just Victoria, and her new in-laws. Victoria's parents joined us for some shots, and I couldn't help but notice how comfortable they all looked together. How easily they fell into poses that spoke of familiarity and shared social understanding. "Now just the mothers," the photographer directed, and suddenly Victoria's mother, Patricia, and I were standing together, smiling at the camera like old friends. "You must be so proud," Patricia murmured as the camera clicked away. "Matthew is quite a catch. Victoria is very lucky." I should have felt complimented, but something about her tone suggested that the luck was entirely one-sided, and not in the direction she'd stated. Dinner was served in the resort's grand ballroom, with round tables decorated with towering centerpieces of white orchids and gold accents. I was seated at the family table, along with Janet, Victoria's parents, her brother and sister-in-law, and an elderly couple who turned out to be Victoria's grandparents from her father's side. The conversation flowed around me like water around a stone. They discussed their latest vacation to Tuscany, the renovation of the Beverly Hills house, the performance of various stock portfolios. I tried to contribute when I could, mentioning my work as a substitute teacher or Janet's career as a school nurse, but our contributions felt small and insignificant in the context of their world. The speeches began after the main course. Victoria's father spoke eloquently about his daughter's accomplishments and his confidence in Matthew's ability to provide for her. Victoria's maid of honor, her sister Chelsea, told charming stories about their childhood and college years. Matthew's best man, his business partner Derek, focused mostly on Matthew's professional successes and his skill at closing deals. When it came time for Matthew to speak, he stood with his champagne glass raised, looking out over the assembled guests. The ballroom fell silent, except for the gentle tinkling of silverware as waiters cleared dishes. "I want to thank everyone for being here tonight to celebrate with Victoria and me," he began, his voice carrying easily through the room's excellent acoustics. "This has been the most perfect day of my life, and having all of you here to share it makes it even more special." He turned to Victoria, who was glowing in the candlelight. "Victoria, you are everything I never knew I was looking for. You're brilliant, beautiful, and you make me want to be a better man every single day. I love you more than I thought it was possible to love another person." The room filled with appreciative murmurs and gentle applause. Victoria dabbed at her eyes with her napkin, careful not to smudge her makeup. Matthew's gaze swept the room and landed on me. "I also want to thank my mother, Eleanor, for being here tonight and for everything she's done to help me become the man I am today." More polite applause, and I felt heat rise in my cheeks as faces turned toward me. But there was something perfunctory about his acknowledgement, something that felt like checking an item off a list rather than expressing genuine gratitude. He raised his glass higher. "To family, to love, and to the future. Mrs. Bigdisati it bis bing. Victoria Briggs." The toast was enthusiastic, glasses clinked throughout the room, and the evening continued with dancing and more champagne. I danced once with Matthew, a stilted, formal dance that felt more like an obligation than a celebration. Then I sat at my table, watching the young couples on the dance floor, feeling every one of my 59 years. It was nearly 10 o'clock when the evening took the turn that would change everything. Matthew had disappeared for a few minutes, and when he returned, he was carrying 2 small jewelry boxes. The band had stopped playing, and someone had given him a microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen," his amplified voice filled the ballroom, "I have a couple of special presentations to make before the evening gets too much later." Victoria looked surprised and delighted, her hands pressed to her chest in anticipation. The guests gathered closer, phones and cameras at the ready. Matthew opened the first box with a flourish, and even from my table 20 feet away, I could see the way the diamonds caught the light. The collective gasp from the assembled guests confirmed what I suspected. This was something extraordinary. "Victoria," Matthew said, his voice full of love and pride, "you are my diamond, my treasure, my most precious gift. I wanted you to have something as beautiful and radiant as you are." He lifted out a stunning diamond necklace, not just one stone, but a cascade of brilliant diamonds that would have looked at home in a museum display case. Victoria's hands flew to her mouth, and tears began streaming down her cheeks as Matthew fastened it around her neck. The applause was thunderous. Guests pressed forward to get better looks. Phones flashed, and Victoria spun slowly so everyone could admire the necklace from all angles. It was a moment of pure theatrical generosity, the kind of grand gesture that people would talk about for years. And then Matthew picked up the second box. My heart was still racing from witnessing Matthew's grand gesture to Victoria when I saw him turn toward me with that second jewelry box. For a moment, just a brief, foolish moment, I felt a flutter of anticipation. Maybe my son had planned something special for me too. Maybe this was his way of showing that even though he was starting a new chapter with Victoria, I still held a place of honor in his life. The microphone crackled slightly as Matthew cleared his throat. "And now," he announced to the room, "I have something for the woman who gave me life, who raised me, who taught me everything I know about love and family." The guests turned their attention toward me, and I felt that familiar mixture of pride and nervousness that comes with being the center of attention. Janet squeezed my arm encouragingly from the seat beside me. Victoria's mother, Patricia, gave me what might have been an approving nod. The photographer positioned himself for what was clearly going to be another significant moment. Matthew walked toward our table, the jewelry box held carefully in his hands. As he got closer, I could see that this box was different from Victoria's, smaller, made of plain cardboard rather than the velvet-lined case that had held the diamond necklace. But I pushed down the small voice of concern in my head. Maybe the size of the box didn't matter. Maybe what was inside would speak to the years we'd shared, the bond between mother and son that no marriage could diminish. "Mom," Matthew said, now standing directly in front of me, the microphone still in his other hand, "you've always been there for me. Through Dad's illness, through the hard times when I was getting my business started, through everything. You've never asked for anything in return." The room was completely silent now, all 200 guests watching this moment unfold. I felt exposed under their collective gaze, but also hopeful. This was my son, my Matthew, speaking from his heart about our relationship. "I wanted to give you something to show how much I appreciate everything you've done," he continued. "Something to remember this special day." He opened the box and lifted out what was inside. The world seemed to slow down as I processed what I was seeing. It was a necklace, yes, but not diamonds, not pearls, not even semi-precious stones. It was a strand of large, brightly colored plastic beads, the kind of costume jewelry you might find at a discount store or a carnival prize booth. The beads were garishly bright, electric blue, hot pink, lime green, orange. They caught the light not with the fire of precious gems, but with the dull gleam of cheap plastic. The silence in the room stretched out like a held breath. I could feel the confusion radiating from the guests, the uncomfortable shifting in chairs, the exchange of glances that said, "Surely this is a joke, surely there's more coming." But there wasn't more coming. Matthew fastened the plastic bead necklace around my neck with the same ceremony he'd shown Victoria, though his movements were quicker, more perfunctory. The beads felt light and hollow against my collarbone, and I was acutely aware of how they must look against my navy dress, like a child's arts and crafts project, like something from a dollar store, like exactly what they were. "There you go, Mom," Matthew said into the microphone, his voice bright with what sounded like genuine satisfaction. "Perfect." He kissed my cheek, and the guests began a polite, uncertain round of applause. But I could hear the difference between this response and the enthusiastic celebration that had greeted Victoria's diamond necklace. This applause was the kind people give when they're not sure what's happening, but feel obligated to respond positively. I touched the plastic beads with trembling fingers, trying to process what had just occurred. Around me, conversations were starting up again. People were returning to their drinks and desserts. The band was preparing to resume playing. The moment was over, and everyone was moving on as if nothing significant had happened. But something significant had happened, something that cut deeper than I initially understood. Matthew returned to Victoria's side, where she was still admiring her diamond necklace and accepting congratulations from guests who wanted a closer look. I watched my son's face as he rejoined his wife, saw the way he looked at her with such pride and adoration. Then I caught him glancing back at me, and for just a second, our eyes met across the room. What I saw in his expression made my blood turn cold. It wasn't embarrassment or regret, or even confusion about how his gesture had been received. It was satisfaction, not the warm satisfaction of having done something thoughtful, but something harder and more calculated, like someone who had just solved a problem efficiently. "Eleanor, dear, what a unique necklace." Patricia Lane's voice cut through my swirling thoughts. Victoria's mother had appeared beside me, her own jewelry, real pearls, and what looked like a genuine ruby brooch, catching the light as she leaned in closer. I could hear the careful diplomacy in her tone, the way someone speaks when they're trying not to say what they're really thinking. What she was really thinking was written clearly on her face: pity, embarrassment, and perhaps a touch of satisfaction that the social hierarchy had been so clearly established. "Yes," I managed to say, my voice sounding strange and distant to my own ears. "It's very colorful. Matthew has such a creative sense of humor," Patricia continued, though we both knew there had been nothing humorous about the moment. "He certainly knows how to surprise people." Janet appeared at my other side, her face a storm cloud of barely contained fury. My sister had never been good at hiding her emotions, and she looked like she wanted to march over to Matthew and give him a piece of her mind. "Ellie," she said quietly, "we should get some air." But I couldn't move. I was frozen in place, still trying to understand what had just happened, still hoping that maybe I was misunderstanding somehow. Maybe this was the first part of a surprise. Maybe there was something else coming. Maybe my son hadn't just publicly humiliated me at his own wedding. The dancing had resumed, and I watched as Matthew led Victoria onto the floor for what the DJ announced as their first dance as husband and wife. They moved together beautifully, Victoria's diamond necklace sparkling under the ballroom lights, both of them glowing with happiness and love. I touched my plastic beads again, feeling their cheap lightness, their complete lack of value or meaning. The contrast couldn't have been more stark or more intentional. Mrs. Benguki, Briggs, a young woman, had approached our table. One of Victoria's bridesmaids, I thought, though I couldn't remember her name. "I just wanted to say congratulations. The wedding is absolutely beautiful." "Thank you," I replied automatically. "And what an interesting necklace," she continued, her eyes fixed on the plastic beads. "So bold. Is it vintage?" The question might have been innocent, but something in her tone suggested otherwise. I realized that the story of Matthew's gifts was already spreading through the reception, becoming gossip, becoming entertainment. People were talking about the diamonds and the plastic beads, about the stark difference between what the bride received and what the groom's mother got. "It's from my son," I said simply, because what else could I say? "Oh, how sweet," the bridesmaid replied, but her smile didn't reach her eyes. "Well, enjoy the rest of the evening." As she walked away, I saw her immediately approach another group of guests, and I didn't need to hear their conversation to know what she was sharing. The laughter that followed her animated whispers confirmed my suspicions. I was becoming a joke, the mother of the groom who got plastic beads while the bride got diamonds. It would make a great story at future parties, a perfect example of a social faux pas or a tone-deaf gesture. People would laugh about it for years, always concluding with some variation of, "Can you imagine?" Janet's hand found mine under the table. "We're leaving," she said firmly. "Right now." "I can't leave," I whispered back. "It's Matthew's wedding. I'm his mother, and he's treating you like garbage," Janet replied, her voice shaking with anger. "In front of 200 people. This isn't about you being his mother anymore, Ellie. This is about you having some dignity." But I still couldn't make myself stand up. Part of me kept hoping that Matthew would realize what he'd done, that he'd come over and explain, that there would be some resolution that would make sense of this nightmare. Instead, I watched as he continued to dance with Victoria, as he laughed with his groomsmen, as he accepted congratulations and toasts from guests. He seemed completely unbothered by what had transpired, completely unaware that he had just publicly demonstrated exactly how little his mother meant to him. The evening continued around me like a movie I was no longer part of. Courses were served and cleared away. More toasts were made. The bouquet was thrown, caught by Victoria's college roommate. The garter was removed and tossed, caught by Matthew's business partner, to much cheering and laughter. Through it all, I sat at my table wearing my plastic beads, feeling them grow heavier with each passing minute. Other guests stopped by occasionally to make polite conversation, but I could see the curiosity in their eyes, the way they glanced at my necklace and then exchanged looks with their companions. Around 11 o'clock, Matthew finally made his way back to our table. He looked flushed and happy, his bow tie loosened, his hair slightly messed from dancing. "Hey, Mom, having a good time?" he asked, his tone casual and cheerful, as if nothing unusual had happened. I looked up at my son, this man I had carried in my body, nursed through countless childhood illnesses, cheered at every baseball game and school play, supported through college and the early years of his career. This person who had just reduced me to a public spectacle. "Matthew," I said quietly. "Why?" His expression flickered for just a moment, a shadow of something crossing his features, but then his smile returned, brighter and more forced than before. "Why what, Mom? I wanted to get you something special for tonight, something fun and colorful, something that would make you smile." He gestured toward my necklace. "It suits you. It's very you." The word you hung in the air between us like a slap. What did that mean exactly? That plastic beads were appropriate for me, that I didn't deserve anything genuine or valuable, that my place in his life was decorative at best, disposable at worst. "It's very different from Victoria's necklace," I said carefully. Matthew's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Victoria is my wife, Mom. That's a different kind of gift for a different kind of relationship." There it was, the truth, finally spoken aloud. Victoria was his wife, his priority, his future. I was his mother, a role that apparently came with plastic jewelry and public embarrassment. "I see," I said, and I did see, clearly, finally, painfully. "Good," Matthew replied, already turning his attention back to the party. "I'm glad you understand." But what I understood wasn't what he thought I understood. What I understood was that my son had become someone I didn't recognize. What I understood was that the little boy who used to bring me dandelions had grown into a man who thought plastic beads were good enough for his mother. What I understood was that I had somehow failed so completely as a parent that my own child felt comfortable humiliating me in public. Victoria appeared at Matthew's side, glowing and gorgeous, her diamond necklace catching the light with every movement. "Eleanor," she said, her voice honey-sweet, "thank you again for such a wonderful evening. Everything has been absolutely perfect." Perfect. Yes, from her perspective, I suppose it had been. "The necklace Matthew chose for you is so unique," Victoria continued, her eyes fixed on my plastic beads with what might have been amusement. "He has such a creative eye for gifts." I realized in that moment that Victoria knew exactly what message the necklace was meant to send. She understood the hierarchy that had been established, the pecking order that had been made crystal clear, and she was enjoying it. "Yes," I managed to say, "he certainly does." Matthew's arm tightened around Victoria's waist, and they exchanged a look that spoke of private jokes and shared understanding. I was the outsider now, the relic of his previous life, the obligation that had to be managed and contained. The band announced the last dance of the evening, and couples began making their way onto the floor. Matthew and Victoria joined them. Lost in their own world of new marriage and bright futures, I watched them sway together under the ballroom lights. And for a moment, I remembered dancing with David at our own wedding reception 35 years ago. We'd been young and poor and so deeply in love, and we danced to a scratchy recording of Dayton, "The Way You Look Tonight," in the church fellowship hall, while our families and friends cheered us on. There had been no diamond necklaces that night, no expensive venues or professional photographers, but there had been joy and love, and the promise of a future built together. Looking at Matthew and Victoria now, I wondered if they had that same foundation, or if their marriage was built on the same shallow values that had led to plastic beads for mothers and diamonds for wives. The last dance ended, and guests began the slow process of gathering purses and saying goodbyes. I knew I should go congratulate the happy couple one final time, should make the rounds and thank people for coming, should play the role of the gracious mother of the groom until the very end. Instead, I sat at my table and carefully removed the plastic bead necklace from around my neck. The plastic beads felt impossibly light in my hands as I held them in my lap, hidden beneath the white linen tablecloth. Around me, the reception was winding down with the organized chaos of any large event ending. Waiters clearing glasses, guests collecting their belongings, the photographer capturing final candid moments of laughter and embraces. I should have been part of it all. I should have been standing by the exit with Matthew and Victoria, thanking guests for coming, accepting their congratulations, playing the role of the proud mother-in-law. Instead, I sat alone at my table, staring at the cheap necklace that had somehow crystallized everything wrong with my relationship with my son. "Eleanor," Janet's voice cut through my thoughts. She had returned from the ladies' room and was looking at me with concern. "You took it off." I nodded, not trusting my voice. "Good," she said firmly, settling back into her chair. "That thing was an insult, and everyone in this room knew it." "Did they?" I asked quietly. "Or am I being overly sensitive?" Janet's expression hardened. "Ellie, I watched that whole performance. I saw the way people reacted. I heard the whispers. Matthew gave his new wife a necklace that probably cost more than some people's cars, and he gave his mother something that wouldn't be appropriate for a child's dress-up box." She leaned closer, lowering her voice, and the way he presented it, like it was some grand gesture, like you should be grateful for plastic beads. "That wasn't thoughtlessness, honey. That was deliberate." Deliberate. The word hit me like a physical blow because I knew Janet was right. This hadn't been a mistake or a momentary lapse in judgment. The presentation had been too carefully orchestrated, too public, too perfectly timed to be anything other than intentional. But why? That was the question that kept circling in my mind like a trapped bird. Why would Matthew want to humiliate me? What had I done to deserve such treatment? Had I been too needy, too present in his life? Had I somehow interfered with his relationship with Victoria? Had I failed him as a mother so completely that this was his way of cutting me down to size? "Mrs. Briggs," a server appeared beside our table, young and polite, probably working his way through college. "Would you like me to box up any of the centerpiece flowers for you to take home?" The bride said family members were welcome to them. I looked at the elaborate orchid arrangement in the center of our table, another expensive touch in an evening full of them. The flowers were beautiful, but the thought of carrying them home felt suddenly absurd. What would I do with white orchids that probably cost more than my weekly grocery budget? Put them in my modest kitchen in Chula Vista and pretend they belonged there. "No, thank you," I said, "but that's very kind." The server moved on to the next table, and I watched as other guests accepted their floral arrangements with delight. Victoria's relatives were collecting multiple centerpieces, joking about how their houses would smell like a florist shop. They belonged in a world where expensive flowers were casual gifts, where diamond necklaces were romantic gestures, where the cost of one evening's celebration could fund a year of someone else's life. "We should go," Janet said gently. "There's no point in staying." I knew she was right, but leaving felt like surrender. It felt like admitting that I didn't belong here, that I had no place in Matthew's new life, that the plastic beads had accomplished exactly what they were meant to accomplish. "I should say goodbye to Matthew," I said, though the words felt heavy in my mouth. "Should you?" Janet asked. "What exactly are you going to say?" "Thank you for the lovely jewelry. Congratulations on your perfect wedding." "Sorry I'm not good enough for real gifts." Her bluntness stung, but it also clarified something for me. What could I say to Matthew that wouldn't make this situation worse? If I thanked him, I'd be accepting the humiliation. If I confronted him, I'd be causing a scene at his wedding reception. If I pretended nothing had happened, I'd be enabling his behavior. The only option that preserved any dignity at all was silence. I stood up slowly, my legs feeling unsteady after sitting for so long. The ballroom looked different from this perspective, smaller somehow, despite its grandeur. The golden light that had seemed so elegant earlier now felt garish. The laughter and conversation that had provided such a festive soundtrack now sounded hollow and artificial. Janet gathered her purse and shawl, ready to leave with me. As we moved away from our table, I caught sight of Matthew across the room. He was standing with a group of his business associates, gesturing animatedly as he told some story that had them all laughing. Victoria was beside him, radiant in her reception dress, her diamond necklace catching the light every time she moved. They looked like the perfect couple, young, successful, beautiful, surrounded by wealth and opportunity. And they were. That was perhaps the most painful part of all this. Matthew had achieved everything he'd worked for. He had the business, the money, the stunning wife, the social position. The only thing that didn't fit into his perfect picture was me. Eleanor! Patricia Lane appeared in our path, perfectly coiffed despite the long evening, her smile as polished as her appearance. Leaving so soon? The night is still young. It's been a long day, I replied diplomatically. Everything was beautiful. You should be very proud. Oh, we are, Patricia said, her eyes glittering with satisfaction. Victoria looked absolutely radiant, didn't she? And that necklace Matthew gave her, simply breathtaking. I've never seen anything quite like it. She paused, and I knew what was coming next. Your necklace was very interesting as well, she continued, her gaze dropping to where the plastic beads had been. Such bold colors. Very artistic. As if Matthew had been making some kind of creative statement rather than delivering a calculated insult. Yes, I said simply, offering no explanation or defense. Well, Patricia continued, clearly hoping for more of a reaction. Matthew certainly has eclectic taste in jewelry. I suppose that's what makes him such a successful businessman, thinking outside the box. Janet's hand found my elbow, steadying me. We really should be going, she said firmly. Early flight tomorrow. It was a lie. Janet wasn't flying out until Monday, but it provided the excuse we needed to extract ourselves from the conversation. Of course, Patricia said. Safe travels. It was lovely seeing you both. As we walked away, I heard Patricia's voice behind us, already engaged in conversation with another guest, no doubt discussing the evening's events, including the curious case of the mother-in-law and her plastic jewelry. We made our way through the ballroom, past clusters of guests still enjoying their drinks and desserts. A few people nodded politely as we passed, but no one stopped us for conversation. I wondered if word had already spread about my graceless exit, if people were relieved to see me go. At the ballroom entrance, I paused and looked back one more time. The reception was still in full swing, the celebration continuing without any acknowledgement of my departure. Matthew was still holding court with his friends. Victoria was still glowing in her designer dress and diamond necklace, and the world was still spinning exactly as it had been before. That was when it really hit me. I could disappear from this room, from this event, possibly from Matthew's life entirely, and nothing would change. The party would go on, the marriage would continue, and the plastic beads would become just another amusing anecdote in the story of their perfect wedding. Ready? Janet asked softly. I nodded, and we walked out of the ballroom together. The resort's marble corridors felt different now, cooler, quieter, almost echoing with our footsteps. The elegant artwork and carefully arranged flowers that had impressed me earlier now seemed like elaborate window dressing, beautiful but cold. As we waited for the valet to bring Janet's rental car around, I found myself thinking about David. What would he have said about tonight? Would he have been proud of Matthew's success, impressed by the expensive venue and elaborate celebration? Or would he have seen what I was seeing, that somewhere along the way, our son had lost touch with the values we'd tried to instill in him? David had always been the moral compass in our family. He was the one who insisted that Matthew thank his little league coach personally, not just wave from the car window. He was the one who made sure Matthew understood that respect was earned through character, not wealth. He was the one who taught our son that how you treat people says everything about who you are. If David had been alive tonight, this never would have happened. Not because he would have stopped Matthew, but because Matthew never would have become the kind of person who would humiliate his mother for sport. Your car, ma'am, the valet said, holding open the passenger door of Janet's silver Honda. As I settled into the seat, I realized I was still holding the plastic bead necklace. I looked down at the gaudy colors, the cheap materials, the complete absence of thought or care that it represented. For a moment, I considered throwing it away, tossing it in the landscaping or dropping it in the resort's fountain. But then I carefully placed it in my purse instead. I would keep it, not as a memento of my son's wedding, but as a reminder of who Matthew had become and what I apparently meant to him now. A reminder that love isn't always returned in the measure it's given, and that sometimes the people who should cherish you the most are the ones who hurt you the deepest. Janet started the car and pulled away from the resort's circular drive. In the rearview mirror, I watched the elegant building grow smaller until it disappeared entirely behind the landscaped hills. The Pacific Ocean stretched out to our left, dark and infinite under the night sky. "Where to?" Janet asked as we reached the main road. "Home," I said simply. But as we drove through the empty streets of San Diego, past the closed shops and darkened office buildings, I realized I wasn't sure where home was anymore. The house in Chula Vista, where I'd raised Matthew, where David and I had built our life together, where I'd spent the last 8 years learning to live alone, was that still home? Or had it become just another place where I didn't quite belong? The freeway was mostly empty at this hour, just the occasional truck or late-night commuter sharing the road with us. The silence in the car was comfortable. Janet understood that I needed time to process what had happened, that words couldn't fix what had been broken tonight. As we crossed from one freeway to another, following the familiar route back to my neighborhood, I found myself thinking about the moment when Matthew had fastened the plastic beads around my neck, the weight of his hands on my shoulders, the brief kiss on my cheek, the satisfied expression on his face as he stepped back to admire his handiwork. That expression haunted me most of all. It wasn't the look of someone who had made a mistake or misjudged a situation. It was the look of someone who had accomplished exactly what they'd set out to do. But what, exactly, had that been? What message was the plastic necklace supposed to send? That I should know my place? That I wasn't worthy of the same consideration as his wife? That our relationship had fundamentally changed now that he was married? Or maybe the message was simpler than that. Maybe it was just, "I don't respect you anymore." We exited the freeway and entered the familiar streets of my neighborhood. The modest homes with their small front yards and older cars parked in driveways looked shabby after an evening at the luxury resort, but they also looked real in a way that the resort hadn't, lived in, authentic, unashamed of their imperfections. Janet pulled into my driveway and turned off the engine. The sudden silence felt heavy with everything that had happened and everything that had been left unsaid. "You want me to come in?" she asked. "I could make some tea. We could talk." "No," I said quietly. "Thank you, but I think I need to be alone right now." She nodded, understanding. "Call me tomorrow." "I will." I got out of the car and stood in my driveway, watching Janet back out and drive away. Her taillights disappeared around the corner, and I was left alone with the night and the weight of what had transpired. The house key felt strange in my hand as I unlocked the front door. Everything inside was exactly as I'd left it that morning. The breakfast dishes still in the sink, the newspaper folded on the kitchen table, the living room arranged just the way David and I had liked it. But something fundamental had shifted, and even familiar surroundings couldn't quite ground me anymore. I hung my purse on the hook by the door and walked through the quiet rooms, turning on lights as I went. In the bedroom, I caught sight of myself in the dresser mirror and stopped short. I looked older than I had that morning, worn down by the evening's events. My carefully styled hair was still mostly in place. My makeup hadn't completely faded, but something in my eyes had changed. I looked like a woman who had learned something painful about herself and her place in the world. Slowly, I reached into my purse and pulled out the plastic bead necklace. In the harsh light of my bedroom, it looked even more garish and cheap than it had at the reception. I held it up to the mirror, imagining how I must have looked wearing it in front of 200 wedding guests. The humiliation washed over me again, fresh and sharp. But underneath it, something else was building, something harder and more resolute. I opened my jewelry box, the simple wooden one David had given me for our 10th anniversary, and placed the plastic beads inside, right next to my grandmother's pearl earrings and the gold locket Matthew had given me for Mother's Day when he was 12. Tomorrow, I would have to figure out what this evening meant for my relationship with my son. I would have to decide whether to confront him about what had happened or simply accept that this was who he had become. I would have to determine what role, if any, I wanted to play in his new life with Victoria. But tonight, I just wanted to sit with the silence and the truth of what I had learned, that sometimes the people we love most are capable of treating us worse than strangers ever would. I didn't sleep that night. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, replaying every moment of the evening, examining every interaction for clues I might have missed. The digital clock on my nightstand marked the hours: midnight, 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock. By 3, I gave up any pretense of rest and made my way to the kitchen to make coffee. The house felt different in the pre-dawn darkness. Not just quiet, it had been quiet for the 8 years since David's death, but somehow emptier, as if the events of the evening had stripped away even the comfortable solitude I'd grown accustomed to, leaving behind something rawer and more uncertain. I sat at my kitchen table with my coffee, watching the sky slowly lighten outside the window, and tried to make sense of what had happened. But the more I thought about it, the more questions arose. When had Matthew started seeing me as someone who deserved plastic beads? When had I become an embarrassment to him? When had our relationship become something he felt he needed to manage rather than cherish? The answers, I was beginning to realize, had been building for years. I'd just been too hopeful, too willing to make excuses, to see them clearly. There was the Christmas 2 years ago when Matthew had given me a gift card to Target while presenting Victoria with diamond earrings. I told myself it was practical, that he knew I liked to choose my own things, but now I wondered if it had been the beginning of a pattern. There was the Mother's Day when he'd sent flowers to the house but taken Victoria to brunch at the most expensive restaurant in downtown San Diego. I'd convinced myself that it showed how much he loved Victoria, which made me happy for him. But maybe it had been another message about hierarchy, about who deserved his time and attention. There was the way he'd stopped calling just to chat, the way our conversations had become perfunctory check-ins about my health and finances. I'd attributed it to his busy schedule, his growing business responsibilities, but perhaps it had been something else entirely. The sun was fully up by the time my phone rang. I glanced at the caller ID, expecting Janet, but it was Matthew's name on the screen. For a moment, I considered not answering. What could he possibly have to say that would improve the situation? But maternal instinct, even wounded maternal instinct, made me pick up. "Hello, Matthew." "Mom, hi." His voice sounded different, careful, measured. "I wanted to call and thank you for coming last night. The wedding was everything Victoria and I dreamed it would be." I waited for more. An acknowledgement of what had happened, an explanation, an apology. But the silence stretched out until I realized none of those things were coming. "You're welcome," I said finally. "Victoria and I are heading out for our honeymoon in a couple of hours," he continued. "We're going to Tuscany for 2 weeks. She's been planning it for months." Of course they were. Another expensive adventure in their perfect life. "That sounds lovely," I managed. "We'll send you some postcards," Matthew said, and I could hear Victoria's voice in the background, though I couldn't make out the words. "Listen, Mom, I have to run. The car service will be here soon. But I'm glad you enjoyed the wedding." Enjoyed? The word hung in the air like a bitter joke. "Matthew," I said quickly, before he could hang up. "About the necklace?" "What about it?" His tone shifted slightly, becoming more guarded. "Why plastic beads?" There was a long pause. In the background, I could hear the sounds of busy preparation. Suitcases being zipped, Victoria calling out instructions about something. "I thought you'd like them," he said finally. "They're colorful, fun, very you." There it was again. Very you. As if I were someone who naturally belonged with cheap, gaudy things. As if plastic beads accurately represented who I was and what I was worth. "I see," I said, because what else was there to say? "Great. Well, I really do have to go now. We'll talk when we get back from Italy." The line went dead before I could respond. I sat holding the phone for several minutes, listening to the dial tone, processing the complete absence of awareness or remorse in my son's voice. He genuinely seemed to believe that he'd done something thoughtful, that I should be grateful for his gesture. Or maybe he knew exactly what he'd done and simply didn't care about my feelings. The rest of the morning passed in a blur of mundane activities. I showered, made breakfast I couldn't eat, tried to read the newspaper but couldn't focus on the words. Every few minutes, my mind would drift back to the wedding, to the moment when Matthew had fastened those beads around my neck, to the satisfied expression on his face afterward. Around noon, Janet called. "How are you holding up?" she asked without preamble. "I'm fine," I lied. "Bullshit. I've been your sister for 61 years. Eleanor Briggs. I know when you're not fine." Despite everything, I found myself smiling slightly. Janet had never been one to mince words. "Matthew called this morning. I told her. To thank me for coming to the wedding. Did he apologize? No. He said he thought I'd like the plastic beads because they're very me. The silence on Janet's end was so complete, I thought the call had dropped. Janet, I'm here. I'm just trying to decide whether to drive over there and hug you or drive to the airport and catch the first flight to Italy so I can strangle your son. Neither, I said quickly. He's not worth it. But even as I said the words, I wasn't sure I believed them. He was still my son, still the little boy I'd raised and loved and sacrificed for. The problem was figuring out how to reconcile that boy with the man who had publicly humiliated me at his own wedding. What are you going to do? Janet asked. I don't know. What can I do? He's married now. He's made his choice about what kind of person he wants to be. And what kind of person do you want to be in response? The question caught me off guard. I'd been so focused on trying to understand Matthew's behavior that I hadn't considered my own choices. But Janet was right. I did have choices. I could continue pretending that nothing had happened, could maintain the fiction that we had a normal mother-son relationship. I could confront him directly, demanding an explanation and an apology, or I could do something else entirely. I need to think about it, I said. Fair enough. But Ellie, whatever you decide, make sure it's what's best for you, not what's easiest for him. After we hung up, I found myself wandering through the house, looking at the photographs that chronicled Matthew's life from infancy to adulthood. There he was as a chubby toddler, grinning toothlessly at the camera. There he was at 8, gap-toothed and grass-stained after a Little League game. At 16, awkward in his homecoming tuxedo. At 22, proud in his college graduation cap and gown. When had I lost him? When had the sweet, thoughtful child become someone who could treat his mother with such casual cruelty? I stopped in front of one particular photograph. Matthew at age 10, arms wrapped around my waist, both of us laughing at something David had said while taking the picture. The love in that image was so pure, so uncomplicated. We looked like what we were, a mother and son who adored each other. Standing there in my living room holding that photograph, something crystallized in my mind. I couldn't change what Matthew had become, couldn't force him to value me the way I deserved to be valued. But I could change how I responded to his treatment. I could stop making excuses for him, stop accepting crumbs and pretending they were full meals. I could choose dignity. The decision, once made, brought an unexpected sense of relief. I wouldn't beg for Matthew's respect or attention. I wouldn't pretend that plastic beads were an appropriate gift from a successful son to his mother. I wouldn't enable his behavior by acting grateful for scraps. Instead, I would step back. I would create the distance that he had already created, but I would do it on my terms, with my dignity intact. That evening, I sat down at my computer and began typing a letter, not an email. Matthew deserved the formality of actual stationery, actual stamps. I wrote and rewrote it several times, finding the right balance between hurt and dignity, between explanation and accusation. The final version was simple. Dear Matthew, thank you for including me in your wedding celebration. It was clear that you and Victoria have built a beautiful life together, and I wish you both every happiness in your marriage. I've given considerable thought to our relationship and to the gifts exchanged at your reception. While I'm sure you meant well, the contrast between the diamond necklace you gave Victoria and the plastic beads you gave me spoke volumes about how you view my place in your life. I want you to know that I understand the message you were sending, and I accept it. You're building a new family now, with new priorities, and I respect that. Going forward, I will step back and give you the space you clearly need. I love you, and I always will. That will never change, regardless of how our relationship evolves. But I also love myself enough to recognize when I'm not valued, and to act accordingly. I hope Italy is everything you and Victoria dreamed it would be. Love, Mom. I read the letter 3 more times, then sealed it in an envelope and placed it on the kitchen counter. Tomorrow, I would mail it. Tonight, I would try to sleep. But first, I returned to my jewelry box and took out the plastic bead necklace one more time. In the lamplight, it looked even more garish and cheap than I remembered. But as I held it, I realized it wasn't just an insult anymore. It was also a gift of clarity. Those plastic beads had shown me exactly who my son had become. They had forced me to see the truth about our relationship, stripped away the illusions I'd been clinging to for years, and they had given me the push I needed to choose myself over the fantasy of a loving son who no longer existed. I placed the necklace back in the jewelry box, but this time I put it in a separate compartment, away from the pieces that held genuine meaning. It would stay there as a reminder, not of my son's wedding, but of the day I decided to stop accepting less than I deserved. The house felt different as I turned off the lights and headed to bed, still quiet, but no longer empty. For the first time in years, I felt like I was truly home. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new decisions about how to navigate a relationship that had been fundamentally altered. But tonight, I slept peacefully, knowing that I had chosen dignity over delusion, self-respect over self-sacrifice. In the morning, I would mail the letter and begin the process of building a life that didn't revolve around earning my son's approval. It wouldn't be easy, but it would be honest, and after a lifetime of making excuses for other people's behavior, honesty felt like a luxury I could finally afford. The plastic beads had been meant to diminish me, to put me in my place, to remind me of my reduced status in Matthew's life. Instead, they had liberated me. They had shown me that I deserved better than what I was accepting, and they had given me the courage to demand it. As I drifted off to sleep, I found myself thinking not about the humiliation of the wedding reception, but about the possibilities that lay ahead. For the first time in years, my future felt like something I could shape rather than something that would be shaped for me. The plastic beads had taught me a valuable lesson. Sometimes the worst gifts turn out to be exactly what we needed, even if we never wanted them in the first place. The letter sat on my kitchen counter for 3 days before I finally mailed it. Each morning, I would see it there and question whether I was doing the right thing. Was I being too dramatic? Too harsh? Was I letting pride override the possibility of reconciliation? But then I would remember the weight of those plastic beads around my neck, the satisfied expression on Matthew's face, the whispers and glances from the wedding guests, and my resolve would return. This wasn't about pride. This was about self-respect. On Thursday morning, I drove to the post office and dropped the letter in the mail slot. The action felt both monumental and anticlimactic, just a piece of paper disappearing into a blue box, but carrying with it the end of one relationship and the beginning of something else entirely. The days that followed were strange. For years, my routine had been punctuated by thoughts of Matthew, wondering how his business was doing, planning what to cook when he visited, saving up stories to share during our brief phone calls. Now, for the first time since he was born, I had to figure out how to structure my days around my own needs and interests, rather than the hope of connection with my son. It was harder than I'd expected, but also more liberating. I started small. I signed up for a watercolor painting class at the community center, something I'd always wanted to try, but had never made time for. I joined a book club at the local library. I volunteered at the animal shelter, walking dogs and helping with adoption events. These weren't groundbreaking changes, but they were mine. Choices made for my own fulfillment rather than to please someone else or fill empty hours. Janet visited the following weekend, ostensibly to help me clean out some closets, but really to check on my mental state. "You seem different," she observed as we sorted through boxes of old photographs in the spare bedroom. Different how? Lighter, somehow, like you've been carrying something heavy and finally put it down. She wasn't wrong. The constant low-level anxiety about my relationship with Matthew, the wondering if I'd said the wrong thing, done something to upset him, failed to meet his expectations, had disappeared. In its place was something I hadn't felt in years: peace. "Have you heard from him?" Janet asked, holding up a photo of 5-year-old Matthew covered in birthday cake frosting. "No, they're probably still in Italy. And when they get back," I shrugged. "We'll see. The ball is in his court now." 3 weeks after the wedding, Matthew and Victoria returned from their honeymoon. I knew because Victoria posted dozens of photos on social media, the two of them touring vineyards, posing in front of ancient cathedrals, dining at restaurants that looked like they belonged in magazines. They looked happy and tanned and completely absorbed in their new life together. Matthew called on a Tuesday evening. I was in my kitchen, trying out a new recipe for lemon bars, when the phone rang. His name on the caller ID still made my heart skip a beat. Old habits die hard, but I let it ring 3 times before answering. "Hello, Matthew." "Mom." His voice was different from our last conversation. Less casual, more cautious. "We're back from Italy. It was incredible. Victoria loved every minute of it." "I'm glad you had a good time." A pause. "I got your letter." I continued stirring the lemon curd, focusing on the smooth, pale, yellow mixture rather than the tension in my son's voice. "I thought you might. I don't understand why you're upset. I gave you a gift at the wedding. I thought you'd appreciate it." The same tone of bewildered innocence he'd used as a child when caught in obvious misbehavior. Back then, I'd found it endearing. Now, it just confirmed that I'd made the right decision. "Matthew, you gave your wife a diamond necklace that probably cost more than some people make in a year. You gave your mother plastic beads from a craft store. If you truly don't understand why that might be hurtful, then I don't think I can explain it to you." Another pause, longer this time. When he spoke again, his voice had an edge to it. "Victoria is my wife, Mom. Of course her gift was different. That's how marriage works. Different is one thing. Humiliating is another." "I wasn't trying to humiliate you." "Then what were you trying to do?" The question hung in the air between us. I could hear Victoria's voice in the background again, closer this time, as if she were listening to our conversation. "I was trying to give you something fun and cheerful," Matthew said finally. "Something that would make you smile." I'm sorry if you didn't see it that way. It was an apology that wasn't really an apology. The kind that places blame on the recipient for misinterpreting rather than on the giver for poor judgment. I'd received dozens of them from Matthew over the years, and I'd always accepted them gratefully. Just happy to have some acknowledgement of my hurt feelings. "Not anymore. I appreciate that you called," I said calmly. "But I think we have very different perspectives on what happened at your wedding, and I don't think we're going to resolve that tonight." "So what does that mean? Are you going to stop talking to me because you didn't like your gift?" The question was designed to make me feel petty and unreasonable. 6 months ago, it would have worked. I would have backtracked, apologized for overreacting, assured him that of course I didn't want to stop talking to him. Instead, I turned off the burner under my lemon curd and gave him my full attention. "Matthew, I will always love you. You're my son, and nothing will ever change that. But I'm not going to continue pretending that our relationship is something it isn't. You've made it clear through your actions, not just at the wedding, but over the past several years, that I'm not a priority in your life, and that's your right. But it's also my right to stop making you a priority in mine. That's not fair, Mom. You've always what? Called me once a month to check if I'm still alive? Sent me gift cards for Christmas while buying Victoria jewelry? Invited me to your wedding, and then made me a public spectacle." I could hear Victoria's voice more clearly now, though I still couldn't make out the words. She sounded impatient, annoyed. "Victoria thinks you're being dramatic," Matthew said, confirming my suspicion that she was coaching him through this conversation. "Victoria is welcome to her opinion, but this isn't about Victoria. This is about you and me, and how you choose to treat your mother." "I treat you fine, Mom. You're being oversensitive." Oversensitive. Another word designed to dismiss my feelings, to make my hurt seem irrational and excessive. "Perhaps I am," I said, "but that's my prerogative. I'm 59 years old, Matthew. I'm too old to waste time on relationships that don't bring me joy. So our relationship doesn't bring you joy." The pain in his voice was real, and for a moment, my resolve wavered. This was still my little boy. Somewhere underneath the defensive anger and careful indifference, part of me wanted to comfort him, to assure him that everything was fine, to go back to the way things had been. But the way things had been wasn't good for me, and I was finally ready to admit that it brings me sadness more often than joy these days, I said honestly, and I think we both deserve better than that. The silence stretched out so long, I thought he might have hung up. When he finally spoke, his voice was cold and distant. "Fine, if that's how you want it. It's not how I want it, Matthew. It's just how it is. Victoria and I have been talking about having kids soon. I guess they won't have much of a grandmother." The words hit their target perfectly. Matthew had always known exactly how to hurt me, and apparently that skill hadn't diminished with age. The sort of grandchildren I might never know, holidays I wouldn't share, milestones I wouldn't witness, It was almost enough to make me take back everything I'd said. Almost. Any children you have will be lucky to have you and Victoria as parents, I said carefully. And if you ever decide you want me to be part of their lives, you know where to find me. Don't hold your breath. The line went dead. I stood in my kitchen holding the silent phone, feeling like I'd just watched my son die, because in a way I had the Matthew I'd raised, the one who used to tell me I was the best mom in the world, the one who promised he'd always need me. That person was gone. Maybe he'd been gone for years, and I'd just been too afraid to see it. The tears came then, finally. Not the angry tears or the hurt tears I'd shed after the wedding, but the deep, grieving tears of a mother who had lost her child, not to death or distance, but to indifference. I cried for the little boy who used to crawl into my bed during thunderstorms. I cried for the teenager who brought me coffee in bed on Mother's Day. I cried for the young man who used to call me every week just to chat. And I cried for the grandmother I might never become, for the relationship that might never heal, for the love that had somehow transformed into obligation and then into resentment. But when the tears stopped, something unexpected remained. Relief. I had finally stopped pretending. I had finally said out loud what I'd been feeling for years, that our relationship had become one-sided, hurtful, unsustainable. It wasn't what I'd wanted, but it was honest. And after years of accepting less than I deserved, honesty felt like a gift I'd given myself. Over the following months, I built a life that was fuller and richer than I'd expected. The watercolor class led to painting workshops on weekends. The book club introduced me to friends who shared my love of literature and long conversations. The animal shelter work connected me with other volunteers who became genuine companions. I started traveling, small trips at first, just weekend getaways to places David and I had always meant to visit, then longer adventures. A week in New Mexico, 10 days in Colorado, a 2-week cruise through Alaska that left me breathless with its beauty. I wasn't running away from my life. I was finally running toward it. Matthew never called again. I heard about him occasionally through mutual friends. His business was thriving. He and Victoria had bought an even larger house in La Jolla. They were planning a trip to Europe for their first anniversary. The details of his life reached me like news from a foreign country, interesting but irrelevant to my daily existence. A year after the wedding, I received an announcement in the mail. Victoria was pregnant. The card was expensive, embossed, with a professional photograph of the happy couple. My name and address were written in Victoria's careful script, but there was no personal note, no invitation to be involved. I studied the photograph for a long time, looking for traces of the little boy I'd raised in Matthew's face. He looked older, more successful, very much like a man ready to become a father, but I felt nothing beyond a distant wish for their happiness, the same feeling I might have for acquaintances or neighbors. That night, I called Janet. "How do you feel about becoming a great aunt?" I asked. "How do you feel about becoming a grandmother? Honestly, I feel like I'm reading about strangers in the newspaper. Is that terrible?" "No, honey. It's healthy. You can't force love where it isn't welcome." She was right. I could have spent the past year hoping for reconciliation, waiting for Matthew to realize his mistake, making myself available for whatever scraps of attention he might offer. Instead, I had chosen to invest my emotional energy in relationships that actually nourished me. The baby was born 6 months later, a girl they named Sophia. Again, I received an announcement in the mail, again with no personal note. The photograph showed a beautiful baby with Matthew's dark hair and Victoria's delicate features. I felt a brief pang looking at that tiny face, wondering if she would ever know her paternal grandmother, if she would grow up hearing my name at all. But the pang was brief, overwhelmed by gratitude for the life I'd built without waiting for other people to validate my worth. That evening, I was painting in my spare bedroom, now converted into an art studio, when the doorbell rang. I almost didn't answer it. I wasn't expecting anyone, and I was deep into a landscape that was finally starting to look the way I'd envisioned it. But something made me put down my brush and walk to the front door. Through the peephole, I saw a young woman I didn't recognize holding what appeared to be a baby carrier. I opened the door cautiously, keeping the chain lock engaged. "Mrs. Pospoy, Briggs?" the woman asked. "I'm Sarah Chen. I'm a nanny for Matthew and Victoria Briggs. They sent me to ask if you'd like to meet your granddaughter." My heart stopped. Through the crack in the door, I could see the baby carrier more clearly now, and the tiny hand that was waving above its edge. "They sent you?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Sarah looked uncomfortable, shifting the carrier to her other arm. Victoria thought it might be less complicated this way. "If you're interested, I could bring Sophia by sometimes, when they're not home." The offer hung in the air between us like a bridge I could choose to cross or burn. I could accept this indirect contact, these secret meetings with my granddaughter. I could settle for whatever scraps of relationship Victoria and Matthew were willing to offer. Or I could choose dignity, even if it meant missing out on knowing this beautiful child. I looked at the baby in her carrier, Sophia, my granddaughter. A part of my heart I'd never known was missing. She was perfect, innocent, deserving of love and attention, and all the things I dreamed of giving to Matthew's children. But she was also being offered to me like contraband, something to be hidden and compartmentalized and kept separate from her parents. Real life. "Thank you for the offer," I said finally. But no. Sarah looked surprised. "Are you sure? She's a lovely baby. Very calm, very sweet." "I'm sure she is, but I won't be a secret in my granddaughter's life. Either I'm family, anyhow, or I'm not. There's no middle ground." I started to close the door, then stopped. "Please tell Matthew and Victoria that I hope they're very happy, all three of them. But also tell them that if they ever want me to be part of Sophia's life, really part of it, not hidden away like something shameful, they know where to find me." I closed the door gently but firmly, and watched through the peephole as Sarah walked back to her car. The baby carrier bobbed slightly with each step, and I caught one more glimpse of tiny fingers before they disappeared from view. Inside, I leaned against the door and cried again, not the desperate, grieving tears of a year ago, but something gentler and more accepting. I was crying for the grandmother I might have been, for the relationship that might have developed, for the child who would grow up not knowing that she had family who loved her. But I was also proud of myself for not settling for crumbs. My granddaughter deserved better than secret visits and hidden relationships. If Matthew and Victoria couldn't offer me a genuine place in their family, then they couldn't have the convenience of my presence without the commitment. Later that evening, I returned to my painting. The landscape was coming along beautifully, rolling hills in shades of green and gold, a sky that seemed to go on forever. It looked like freedom, like possibility, like all the places I still wanted to explore. I worked on it until well past midnight, adding layers of color and light, bringing it slowly to life. When I finally stepped back to examine my progress, I realized I'd been painting without thinking about Matthew or Victoria, or even Sophia for hours. I'd been painting for the pure joy of creation, for the satisfaction of making something beautiful with my own hands. And in that moment, I understood that I'd found something I'd been searching for my whole adult life without even knowing it, a sense of purpose that belonged entirely to me. The plastic beads were still in my jewelry box, tucked away in their separate compartment. Sometimes, when I was organizing my things or looking for a particular piece, I would come across them and remember that night at the resort, but the sting had faded, replaced by something closer to gratitude. Those gaudy, worthless beads had been the catalyst for the most important decision of my later life. They had forced me to see the truth about my relationship with my son, and they had given me the push I needed to choose myself over the fantasy of unconditional maternal love. They had taught me that sometimes the worst things that happen to us are also the most necessary. 2 years have passed since the wedding now. I'm 61, healthy, and happier than I've been in decades. My art is getting better, my friendships are deeper, and my life is full of purpose and meaning. I travel when I want to, paint when I feel inspired, and spend my time with people who value me for who I am rather than what I can provide. I don't know if I'll ever see Matthew again, or meet my granddaughter, or have the chance to rebuild what we lost. But I've made peace with that uncertainty. I can't control other people's choices, but I can control my own response to them. And my choice is to keep living, keep growing, keep painting landscapes that stretch toward distant horizons. Sometimes the greatest gift we can give ourselves is the courage to walk away from love that diminishes us and to walk toward a life that honors who we truly are. The plastic beads taught me that lesson, and for that, despite everything, I am grateful.